we have to go back to 1888. During that year, a senator in America, actually Senator Blair from New Hampshire, proposed two bills to the US Congress. The first bill was purposed, in fact, to make Sunday a mandatory, Sunday mandatory for every American. It was called Sunday law, part of what was called also blue law. But there was a second bill that was proposed to the Congress, which was, in fact, to make America into a Christian nation. So early Adventist pioneers decided to oppose that bill. As a matter of fact, A.T. Jones decided to go to the US Congress and actually argue against those two bills. So this is how it started. It was in 1888. But they realized that going to speak to the Congress was not sufficient. So the early pioneers decided to create an association that they call NARLA, North American Religious Liberty Association, basically, NARLA, and that was in 1889. But they realized the theme, the topic of religious liberty is universal and therefore could not be limited to the American context. So they expanded the NARLA, National Association for Religious Liberty, into the IRLA, that is the International Religious Liberty Association. And then this now was expanded to other people from all over the world. It was an international association. Now that association, IRLA, was chartered in 1893, basically one of the oldest religious liberty associations. So you can see right from the start, there was a passion to keep separate the state and the church. So, or the state is not to instrumentalize, use the church in order to impose actually religious observance, rituals, and so forth. So the concept of separation of church and state was really very much valued by early pioneers of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, then, after the creation of this International Religious Liberty Association, actually in 1901, the Seventh-day Adventist Church created a department that would focus basically on relations with the international community, and that now was called the PARL department, Public Affairs, and notice because of the interest in religious liberty, so Public Affairs and Religious Liberty, PARL. And that was in 1901 as an official branch within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Interestingly, but things continued to evolve because since now there was a movement that was purposed to create a culture of religious liberty, integrating it in all Seventh-day Adventist institutions around the world. In that context, in 1946, then in the European context, with Jean Nussbaum and with also partnership with Madame Eleanor Roosevelt, then they created a new association, the AIDLR, the Association Internationale pour la Défense de la Liberté Religieuse. So we can see religious liberty in the Seventh-day Adventist context was so dear that the church needed to create a movement. And today you have in every region or divisions of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, you have representative or associations connected to this idea of religious freedom. But I must say the roots of religious freedom is not just historical, right? It's not just historical circumstances because of legal aspect of religious freedom. Religious freedom for Seventh-day Adventists is anchored, grounded actually in the being of God, because God is the God of freedom. And this is extremely important. The origin, the source of freedom is connected to a understanding of who God is, the God of freedom. But I must add to that the reason why God is the God of freedom, it's because God is actually absolutely free. It is interesting that when God revealed God's self to Moses, you know, he say, I am who I am, the everlasting one, the eternal one. So in other words, God cannot be confined to anything. God is absolutely free, dependent on nothing. But this freedom is not just an absolute concept. There is the goal to freedom, and the goal to freedom is actually love. And for the purpose of making love a reality, God created freedom, because love cannot be forced. In order for love to be reciprocated, it is important for the person who loves choose to love. So therefore God, not wanting to create robots, right, who will just do things under certain circumstances, decided to give human beings free will, right? The freedom to choose, freedom to think, freedom of conscience, and freedom to choose, because a covenant, in essence, is impossible without this freedom. Well, this time, actually this is the 130-year anniversary of the creation of IRLA, the International Religious Liberty Association. So 130 years of advocacy for religious liberty. So it is a special year, 2023. Now in August, we will have in Washington, D.C., actually Washington is really a hub, and you have the National Archive Museum, for example, where you have the historical documents that are deeply connected to religious liberty, right? The American Constitution, etc. But, and the Declaration of Independence, and so forth. But what is of importance here to mark this 130-year anniversary is IRLA is looking into providing, right, as a contribution to the thinking about religious liberty, a comprehensive understanding of religious liberty. Because you see, a freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief is actually a compound freedom. In itself, religious liberty presupposes freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, and it of course translates into freedom of choice and freedom of assembly, freedom of association. So, but it undergirds other also freedom, the press, also freedom of expression, for example. Now, what is here of importance? We would like to provide this holistic understanding. So we will have experts from all over the world coming to Washington, D.C., and each speaker will be highlighting a particular facet, dimension of religious freedom. In this way, people will not just compartmentalize religious freedom, but seeing it as a whole, a comprehensive, right, approach to human rights. In fact, also, it will be a time to highlight the fact that all the, you know, there is a convention in Vienna that was in 1993 that emphasized at the time the fact that all human rights are interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible. We can say the same thing about all the freedoms. They are interdependent, and the theme of this conference, for example, on religions and freedom of expression is a case in point or an illustration. In other words, freedom of conscience, thought, of religion or belief is inseparable, actually, from freedom of freedom of expression. In other words, they are connected, they are interrelated, and they are indivisible. It's not just a matter of concern. I would say the positive aspect, rediscovering the depth of freedom of conscience, freedom of belief, freedom of religion. That it's really about what do we mean? You see, by human, we talk about human rights, right? And we tend to focus on the right aspect, the legal aspect. Now, it is important, but what is a human being? And this is where I think we need to rediscover and accept the full humanity of every person before just, you know, speculating about rights. Now, these are important, but again, the deep respect of a human person everywhere in the world, as a person endowed with dignity, inalienable dignity, I would even say, right? That justifies human dignity as the ground and foundation for other human rights. But human dignity itself also illustrates another profound truth about every human being. Again, I'm focusing here on the human aspect. A human person is in fact sacred. I know usually we tend to focus on, okay, holy sites, places as holy places, but the human person, understood actually in the Judeo-Christian and Islamic tradition, human beings are like temples or mosque or cathedral, church, a sacred being before a sacred place or space, basically, in that sense. So the respect of human beings, like if you look at in the Christian tradition, when it is said that your bodies, you human beings, are the temples of the Holy Spirit, temples of God, so that means that human beings ought to be respected. But because of hierarchicalization, the stratification of society into superior and inferior, we tend to lose that even a newborn baby is as important, actually. At every stage of life, a human person is infinitely valuable, basically. Not in terms of human valuing importance, no, but in terms of the very fact of the humanity of that person. You have international instruments. You see, this is not just a religious concept. You have in international law, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18, right, on freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, and so forth, or Article 19 on freedom of expression. So, and you also have in national constitutions everywhere in the world, right, the emphasis on freedom of thought and content. So they are instruments right there, but these we need to now develop a culture, a global culture of human rights where human person, but also groups and societies are respected in their freedom of choice, in their freedom of expression, cultural expression also, why not? And also freedom of religion or freedom of belief for non-religious people, for example. See. Well, they are connected, because you see, again, even here, what is expression? Expression is an outer form of something, of the substance in the person. So you cannot dissociate that. If, in fact, the expression of my being is part of me. So if you curtail, if you prevent, right, my expression is like canceling my humanity. And this is the reason why every person ought to have freedom of expression as part of participation in all areas of societal communication and the communion, even in that sense. So you see, we have to, what is it that is expressed that needs to be emphasized? Well, the person and the opinions of that person. So freedom of thought, again, of opinions, freedom of speech also. Because if you are not allowed to speak, you have no voice. And no voice basically is equivalent to no existence. So that's why it goes much deeper than that. Well, okay, the same, what you find, for example, in freedom of religion or belief, they are limitations. And that is part of international law. For example, a government may have the right, according to international law, to prevent freedom of assembly if it becomes a danger. You know, like during COVID, that was an example. Freedom of association was somehow temporarily, right, interrupted to prevent the spread of the virus, you know. So that is also part, you have limitations, when it comes to, you know, freedom of assembly, so religious freedom, the same, you have limitations when it comes to freedom of expression. If, for example, I use my freedom of expression as hate speech or insulting people, that is totally, right, inappropriate, and that is totally out of place when, in fact, we should not use freedom of expression to express impulses of death, right? Destroying people, insulting, demeaning their dignity. In fact, there is then, therefore, responsibility when it comes to freedom of speech, right? We cannot impose on others our view, because that will be coercion, in fact, and that will be against freedom of conscience, and it will be also against freedom of expression.